Time is 7:20. Temperatures in the upper 50s, lower 60s across the region. In the studio with me is Liz Cheney, who, well, there's a list of things. I never have enough time with it. We ought to just do a 4-hour show one of these days and just talk about everything there is to clear up over here. Okay, next up, Endangered Species Act. Trump administration made some change. Well, that, and let's throw in with that, EPA. He made some changes to some Obama administration EPA things. So, of course, there's some heads exploding on this. So let's start with the Endangered Species Act. What was it before and what did we change to?
Yeah, so the Endangered Species Act, as we've talked about many times before, Glenn, was intended to do something important, which is help us make sure that we can recover and protect endangered species. However, unfortunately, that's not what's happened. That's not how it's been implemented. And when you go back and you look at the statistics, something like only 2% of species ever put on the endangered species list were recovered. And that's a really, terrible track record. And it has become a tool for radical environmentalists in particular to try to prevent all of the other important uses of our land, in particular ag uses, energy uses. And so what is going on now, both in Congress, and Senator Barrasso has been working in particular on this over on the Senate side. We've been working in the Natural Resources Committee on the House side on it, and also from the executive branch with President Trump now in office and Secretary Bernhardt, is a real effort to say, look, we're going to take some small steps to help to improve the way this is implemented, to help to change the rules and the regulations about how we implement. The latest regulations that they've issued are good. They're an important step forward. One of the things that hasn't gotten that much attention, though, that I think ultimately is going to have the biggest impact is what the president has been doing on the courts in terms of putting conservative judges on the courts, because what we see repeatedly, and whether it's the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, EPA you mentioned, is the administration wants to take steps to help to do the right thing, to help to roll back the bad rules and regulation. They do that, and then immediately they're sued. We saw this, for example, with the grizzly just over the last several weeks. And when you have radical environmental groups that say they go find a liberal judge who's willing to overturn what the administration has done administratively. And so I think that what the president is doing and what they've been able to do by confirming all of these conservative judges in the Senate is make sure that going forward in the future, there will be fewer liberal judges who are frankly going to not just interpret the law.
Okay, so let's be a little more distinctive for those who are not understanding quite what you're saying. First off, radical environmental groups. Someone wants to start a project out somewhere, and the environmental group says, well, that little snail, it isn't on the endangered species list, but it could be, therefore you can't build here. Is that what we're talking about? Yeah,
they'll do that, or they'll say, a lot of times what they do is they go in and they say, oh, look, the EPA failed to do everything it's supposed to do in terms of the environmental assessment, the environmental impact study. Okay. And they'll find a liberal judge who's willing to say, yeah, that's right. They didn't do everything they were supposed to do, so stop the rule change.
So by conservative judge, do you mean someone who's just going to implement the law as the way the law was written?
I do. I mean, somebody who recognizes that judges aren't supposed to be making law from the bench.
Right. Okay. So they're not supposed to be deciding what's on, so a judge doesn't decide what's on the endangered species list. But then I got to ask, do the bureaucrats, who decides what's on the endangered species list and why?
Well, it depends. I mean, I think that what you can do is have different groups. One of the big issues that we've looked at in terms of reform of the Endangered Species Act is stopping groups from being able to try to get multiple different species listed simultaneously, because what they do, it's sort of like throwing spaghetti against the wall sometimes, and they'll come in and say all of these 100 different species have got to be listed. And then there are rules and requirements and guidelines for what listing is. But the key thing that happens is you've got all of these species that have been listed, and there are very clear rules for when they should be removed from the list. And, grizzlies are a great example of that. We in Wyoming had a very responsible and effective management plan. We've hit the numbers that are required in terms of bringing grizzlies off the list, and they're not endangered anymore. We ought to be managing our grizzly population at the state level. Same with the wolves. But with respect to grizzlies, the judge came in and said, "Oh, no, 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 I'm going to ignore the science. I'm going to ignore the numbers, the population, the fact that they're recovered, and I'm going to insist that you put them back on the endangered species list." And that's the kind of thing that, we need judges who are actually, not going to ignore the science when it comes to these species and do the right thing in terms of delisting.
Well, there again, so the judge, a more conservative judge, would take a look at, well, this is what the law says, therefore that's what I have to go with and not write the law. Is that what the liberal
I think
judges
that's
are
a
doing?
really important part of it, and I also think we need to fundamentally rewrite the statute itself. I think when you have a statute where only 2% of the species have ever come off of the list, have ever been recovered, clearly there's a problem.
Okay, we got a couple of minutes for this, but this is important too because the Environmental Protection Agency, Obama administration, allowed the Environmental Protection Agency to take Clean Air Act, which sounds good enough, but they declared CO2 to be a pollutant, and then they started writing, I don't call it rules and regulations, those are laws. And so the Trump administration is rolling that back. 22 states are now suing the Trump administration. This really brings to my mind, though, again, how are we making law anymore if we have the regulators writing the law and then again lawsuits deciding what the law is rather than you as a legislator? Yeah,
it's a huge problem. I mean, I think, and I would say we are especially harmed by that here in Wyoming because so many of the bureaucrats who sit in Washington have never been west of the Mississippi, much less to Wyoming. And so you end up in a situation where people are making these pronouncements, writing regulations that have a really devastating impact on our ag industry, on our energy industry, on our home construction industry, without any sense of what they're doing, any sense of the reality of it. So I've been very pleased to see things like the Department of Interior announcing that they're going to move some, huge sections, BLM and others, move those west, move them out to Grand Junction, Colorado. And I think a better understanding across the board in this administration about the really negative impact of these regulations.